There is something deeply rooted in the human heart that pushes us to run toward people whenever life becomes heavy. The moment confusion rises, the moment fear whispers into the mind, the moment a problem appears bigger than our strength. The first instinct of many hearts is not to bow their heads before God, but to pick up a phone, to search for advice, to look for someone who might have an answer. We seek opinions, we seek comfort, we seek direction, yet in the middle of all that searching, there is a quiet question that echoes through eternity. Why do we run to people before we run to God? People can listen, people can sympathize, people can offer thoughts, but people do not possess the wisdom that formed the universe. The same God who stretched out the heavens, who placed every star in its perfect position, who designed the human heart and knows every hidden thought, invites his children to come to him first. Yet many hearts treat God as the final step instead of the first step. They knock on every human door before they ever knock on the door of heaven. There is a dangerous pattern in this habit. When we go to people first, we begin to rely on human understanding rather than divine truth. Human wisdom is limited. It changes with time. It is shaped by emotions, experiences, and imperfect perspectives. One person says one thing, another says something different, and suddenly a troubled heart becomes even more confused because it is drowning in a sea of opinions. But the voice of God does not compete with opinions. The voice of God carries authority, clarity, and truth that never changes. When a person learns to go to God first, something powerful begins to happen inside the soul. Prayer stops being a last resort and becomes the first response. Instead of panic leading the heart, faith begins to lead the heart. Instead of anxiety controlling the mind, trust begins to settle into the deepest places of the spirit. God never intended his children to wander through life desperately seeking answers from a broken world when the Creator himself is ready to guide them. Sometimes people hesitate to go to God first because they believe their problems are too small, too ordinary, or too complicated. Yet the same God who governs galaxies also cares about the quiet struggles of a single human heart. Nothing escapes his attention, nothing surprises him. Before a word is spoken, he already knows the burden that sits on the shoulders of his children. The tragedy is that many people will talk to everyone else about their struggles before they ever whisper a prayer. They will share their worries with friends, they will ask advice from family, they will search endlessly for reassurance. Yet heaven waits patiently for a heart that finally turns upward. God is not distant. God is not silent because he does not care. Many times the silence exists because the heart has not yet paused long enough to seek him. When a person runs to people first, they are placing temporary solutions above eternal guidance. Human encouragement can be helpful, but it cannot replace divine direction. People can comfort for a moment, but only God can transform a situation from the inside out. People can offer suggestions, but God can offer wisdom that reaches beyond what the human mind can understand. There is also another danger in constantly going to people before God. It slowly trains the heart to depend on the approval and validation of others. Decisions begin to revolve around what others think rather than what God desires. The voice of culture becomes louder than the voice of truth. The opinions of the crowd begin to shape choices that should have been guided by prayer. A heart that seeks God first develops a different kind of strength. It becomes steady when circumstances are unstable. It becomes peaceful even when the world around it is filled with noise. When a person kneels before God before speaking to anyone else, they receive something that no human conversation can provide. They receive perspective. They receive clarity. They receive the quiet assurance that the one who controls every moment of time is already working beyond what the eyes can see. God is not intimidated by the complexity of human problems. What seems impossible to people is simple in the hands of the Creator. When believers approach him first, they acknowledge his authority, his power, and his wisdom. They recognize that the same God who opened seas, moved mountains, and changed the course of history is still present, still listening, and still guiding those who seek him with sincerity. Imagine how different life becomes when the first reaction to trouble is prayer instead of panic. When confusion appears, the heart turns toward God. When decisions need to be made, the first conversation happens with heaven. When fear begins to rise, faith interrupts it with trust in the one who sees the end from the beginning. There is something humbling about going to God first because it requires admitting that human strength is not enough. It requires recognizing that no friend, no counselor, no crowd of voices can replace the wisdom that flows from the throne of God. It is an act of surrender that says the Creator knows more than the creation. and his guidance carries more weight than the shifting opinions of the world. God does not ask his children to ignore people or reject wise counsel, but he calls them to place him in the highest position. When God is first, every other voice finds its proper place. Advice becomes clearer, decisions become wiser. The heart becomes calmer because it is anchored in something far greater than human understanding. A life that consistently goes to God first begins to reflect a deep trust in his character. It shows a belief that God is listening, that God is present, and that God cares enough to guide the steps of those who seek him. It reveals a faith that understands that while people may fail, misunderstand, or change their opinions, God remains faithful, constant, and true. There is a subtle but powerful shift that happens in the heart when a person begins to depend on human wisdom before seeking the guidance of God. At first, it may not seem dangerous. It was natural to ask someone what they think, to search for advice, to gather opinions, to lean on the voices around us. Yet beneath that habit, there is a deeper issue that often goes unnoticed. When human wisdom becomes the first place we turn, it quietly replaces the authority that belongs to God. Human wisdom has limits. Every person sees life through a narrow window of experience. What someone believes is right may simply be shaped by what they have lived through, what they have heard, or what they have felt. Advice can be sincere and still be incomplete. Guidance can be well-meaning and still be flawed. Even the smartest minds carry blind spots because no human being sees the full picture of life the way God does. God's wisdom does not come from experience because he already knows the beginning and the end. His understanding is not shaped by time because he stands outside of time. What appears confusing to people is already clear to him. What feels uncertain to the human heart is already settled in his perfect knowledge. Many people move through life relying more on conversations with others than on communion with the one who sees every detail. When people lean first on human understanding, decisions often begin to follow emotions instead of truth. A person may receive advice that sounds comforting in the moment, but comfort does not always lead to the right path. Sometimes the most loving guidance from God challenges the heart instead of soothing it. Human wisdom often tries to avoid discomfort, but divine wisdom focuses on transformation. There are moments in life when a person hears 10 different opinions about the same situation. One voice says go forward, another voice says wait, another voice says walk away, and suddenly the mind becomes crowded with conflicting thoughts. The heart grows heavier because the search for answers becomes more confusing with every new opinion. The problem is not that people are trying to help. The problem is that human wisdom was never designed to replace divine direction. When a person seeks God first, the heart begins to receive something that human advice cannot produce. There is a quiet clarity that comes from the presence of God. It is not always loud, and it does not always come instantly, but it brings a deep sense of peace that human opinions rarely provide. The guidance of God carries a weight that settles the soul. Many people believe they are being practical when they rely first on human understanding. They think gathering opinions is the safest path. Yet safety built only on human reasoning can quickly collapse when circumstances change. The world shifts constantly. Ideas change, perspectives evolve, and advice that seemed wise yesterday may appear foolish tomorrow. But the wisdom of God does not change because his truth is not built on shifting foundations. Depending on human wisdom before seeking God also shapes the direction of the heart. Over time, a person may begin to trust their own reasoning more than the voice of the Lord. Pride quietly grows when a person believes they can figure everything out through logic, strategy, or advice from others. The heart begins to believe that the answers can be found everywhere except in prayer. Yet history repeatedly shows the weakness of human wisdom when it stands alone. People build plans that fail, create solutions that break, and follow paths that lead to disappointment. Human understanding often focuses on what can be seen in the moment, but God sees beyond the moment into the future that no human mind can fully imagine. The wisdom of God reaches deeper than strategy or knowledge. It touches motives, intentions, and the hidden desires of the heart. When a person seeks God first, they are not only asking for answers, they are inviting transformation. God does not simply guide decisions. He reshapes the heart that is making those decisions. There is also a profound humility in turning to God before relying on human wisdom. It acknowledges that human intelligence, education, and experience are not enough to navigate every situation. It recognizes that the Creator understands life more completely than the creation ever could. This humility opens the door for divine wisdom to begin shaping the path ahead. When someone consistently goes to God before gathering opinions, something remarkable happens in their decision-making. They still listen to others, but they are no longer controlled by every voice. Advice becomes something they weigh carefully instead of something that directs their entire life. God's guidance becomes the anchor that steadies every other influence. This kind of dependence on God changes how a person views problems. Instead of seeing challenges as overwhelming puzzles that must be solved through human effort alone, they begin to see them as opportunities to trust a wisdom far greater than their own. The heart learns to pause, to pray, and to seek direction from the one who never makes mistakes. Human wisdom can assist, encourage, and sometimes illuminate certain paths, but it cannot replace the perfect understanding that comes from God. When a person reverses the order and places divine guidance above human advice, life begins to move with a different rhythm. Decisions become less rushed, the heart becomes less anxious, and faith begins to guide choices that once were driven by uncertainty. The difference between human wisdom and divine wisdom is the difference between a candle and the rising sun. A candle can give a small amount of light, enough to see a few steps ahead. But when the sun rises, everything becomes visible. Paths that were hidden become clear. Obstacles that once seemed confusing suddenly appear obvious. In the same way, when the wisdom of God rises in a person's life, understanding begins to replace confusion, direction begins to replace hesitation, and faith begins to replace the fragile confidence that once rested only on human understanding. There's a habit many people develop without even realizing it. When life becomes difficult, when decisions grow complicated, when fear begins to whisper into the mind, they search everywhere for answers before they finally turn their attention toward God. They exhaust every conversation, explore every possibility, knock on every human door, and only when nothing else seems to work do they finally bow their heads and pray. In that moment, God becomes the last option instead of the first place they turn. This pattern reveals something about the human heart. It shows how easy it is to treat God like a final rescue plan rather than the primary source of direction. Many people do not intentionally push God to the side, yet their actions quietly place him there. They trust their own strength first. They trust their plans first. They trust the voices of people around them first. Only when those things fail do they remember that heaven is still waiting to hear their voice. God was never meant to be the final step in a desperate search for solution. He is meant to be the starting point for every decision, every concern, every burden that rests on the heart. The Creator of the universe does not belong at the end of a long list of options. He belongs at the very beginning of every path a person walks. When someone treats God as the last option, they often carry unnecessary weight through life. They struggle with anxiety longer than they should. They wrestle with confusion longer than they need to. They move through problems relying on their own strength until exhaustion forces them to look upward. Yet the invitation from God has always been simple. Come first. Seek me before anything else. Place your trust in me before the world has a chance to shape your thinking. There's a powerful shift that takes place when a person begins to see God as the first place to go rather than the final place to turn. Instead of reacting to problems with panic, the heart learns to respond with prayer. Instead of allowing fear to take control of the mind, faith begins to guide the response. The situation may not instantly change, but the perspective inside the heart begins to transform. Many people hesitate to go to God first because they believe they must handle things on their own before bringing them to Him. They feel as though they should try every possible solution before asking for divine help. But that thinking misunderstands the nature of God. He is not a distant observer waiting to be contacted only after human effort fails. He is a loving Father who desires to guide His children from the very beginning of every challenge. When God becomes the first place a person goes, the relationship between the heart and heaven deepens. Prayer stops, feeling like an emergency call, and begins to feel like daily communication. Trust grows stronger because the heart becomes accustomed to seeking God in every situation rather than only in moments of crisis. There is also a difference in the peace that fills a life when God is first instead of last. When people rely on themselves or others before seeking Him, they often feel constant pressure to figure everything out. The responsibility for solving every problem rests on their own shoulders. But when the heart turns to God first, that weight begins to lift. A burden is placed into the hands of the one who has unlimited wisdom and power. God's guidance does not always arrive in dramatic ways. Sometimes it comes through quiet conviction in the heart. Sometimes it appears through clarity that slowly forms during prayer. Sometimes it reveals itself through circumstances that open one path and close another. Yet the person who goes to God first begins to notice these moments more clearly because their attention is focused on Him from the start. When God is treated as the last option, the heart often approaches Him in frustration. The prayer becomes filled with desperation because every other attempt has failed. But when God is the first place someone goes, prayer carries a different spirit. It comes with trust rather than exhaustion. It begins with faith instead of defeat. There is also a deeper truth hidden in this shift of perspective. Going to God first is an act of surrender. It means recognizing that human strength is limited and divine wisdom is greater. It means acknowledging that no strategy, no plan, and no advice from the world can replace the direction that comes from the Creator. A life that begins every challenge with prayer develops a strong spiritual foundation. When storms appear, that foundation keeps the heart steady. When confusion rises, it provides direction. When fear tries to take control, it reminds the soul that the one who holds the universe is already aware of every detail. People often believe they must face life alone until things become unbearable. Yet God has always been present, waiting for His children to turn toward Him at the very first sign of trouble. His presence is not reserved for the final moments of desperation. It is available at the beginning of every question, every decision, and every burden that enters the human heart. The difference between going to God first and going to Him last shapes the entire journey of faith. One path leads through constant worry, endless searching, and fragile confidence in human strength. The other path leads through trust, guidance, and the quiet assurance that the one who created life is actively involved in directing it. When a person begins to change the order and place God at the center of every moment, the rhythm of life begins to shift. Prayer becomes the doorway through which every challenge passes. Faith becomes the lens through which every situation is viewed. Trust becomes the strength that replaces the constant need to control every outcome. God was never meant to be a distant solution waiting at the end of human effort. He was always meant to be the first voice heard when questions arise, the first refuge sought when fear appears, the first source of wisdom when decisions stand before the heart.